I'd like to introduce April. Back in the spring, we were planning to have for Hiroshima Day, not just to remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also those people who have suffered since 1945 because of nuclear weapons. And certainly the largest group are those people who live or whose families lived in the Pacific. And as 1946 was the first detonation of an atomic weapon in the Pacific, we felt this was appropriate. And I attended an anniversary memorial celebration that the Marshallese Education Initiative had at the end of June, beginning of July. And so then I contacted April after that. As you'll see, she founded this initiative in 2013, and its purpose is to raise awareness of Marshallese history and culture, particularly the shared nuclear testing legacy amongst non-Marshallese, and so her talk to us today. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Arkansas, where she is located, and that focused on US foreign policy. April is currently completing a brief textbook on Marshallese history and culture that accompanies a class she teaches with Marshallese colleagues at the initiative, and is also writing a historic monograph on the Marshallese diaspora in Arkansas, which is the largest concentration of Marshallese outside the Pacific. She teaches full-time at Northwest Arkansas Community College, and I would now like to welcome and hand over to April.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the introduction, Sue. Sue and I have been able to have really good conversations in the past, long distance conversations, but they've been a pleasure. So nice to meet everyone. And as Sue mentioned, I co-founded MEI back in 2013 with a colleague who had studied for a couple of years in the Marshall Islands. She's an ethnomusicologist now. She's at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, where she teaches musicology. But we started out, my research was based on US Latin American relations post-World War II, so the early Cold War years. And so I have basically had to learn this history in these past 8 years. But there aren't that many people who know much about the Marshallese experience or the nuclear testing legacy. I normally am joined in these talks with at least one of my colleagues from MEI. We have right now about 8 staff members. Most are part-time, but we have 3 that are full-time. Benedict Madison is one of our full-timers, and he focuses on nuclear and climate issues. He is actually on his way to New York right now to attend some meetings and actually go to the UN as a guest one day. So we're really excited for him. And then Marcina, who also works with youth programming, but because of COVID, she's sort of been switched over to helping Marshallese with rental assistance and utilities and some of the other things. And we'll talk just briefly about that. But I wanted to introduce them kind of virtually. We're going to show just a 2-3 minute clip that we just created for them for the National Nuclear Commission in Majuro in the Marshall Islands that talks a little bit about what they do. So I've worked with these young people for about 8 years since MEI started. Benedict is one of the first Marshallese that I began working with when he was just a pup. He was still in high school. So I'm really proud of the 2 of them. I wish they could have joined us, but alas, they could not. So just briefly, and I know these slides are kind of full. I'm just going to touch on a few things with each of them, but just wanted to give you a little bit of background. So I am not Marshallese. I was actually born in Arkansas, And again, as I mentioned, started this nonprofit with another non-Marshallese. And our initial goal was to try to raise awareness locally about the Marshallese story. We had some programming at the college where I teach, and I knew very little about the community or the history. And apparently no one else in our community knew either. And so this was the point of us starting this nonprofit, was just try to raise that awareness among non-Marshallese. And then a few years ago, we were able to secure some funding, which allowed us to actually hire a staff. And so this is where our staff comes in with everyone on staff is Marshallese and lives here in Arkansas. Arkansas is where the majority of Marshallese within the continental United States reside. They've moved out to the Midwest to seek education, access to health care. And then, of course, they have been pushed out due to the US nuclear testing legacy. So the Marshall Islands are located in the North Central Pacific. So it's a little odd, you know, that so many of them have ended up in Arkansas, but the atolls are very low lying. And so they're very susceptible to climate change, sea level rise, increased storms, and such. And so we've got some push-pull factors as to why the Marshallese are in the Midwest, the push being the nuclear legacy. And again, in this presentation, again, I normally have Benedict joining me on the history part, and he talks about the rich culture just briefly, because we usually don't have a whole lot of time, but just a couple of things here. The name of the Marshall Islands is actually given by a British sea captain who passed by these atolls that were unmapped and named them after himself, of course. But the Marshallese word, island kind ad, means pretty much everything above the currents. So the land, the flora, the fauna, the clouds, the sky. So a very holistic view of their world. Again, a very rich culture, history of navigation, a very unique way of navigating known as wave piloting. These master canoe builders and captains were able to kind of sense where they were as they traveled between atolls based on just the feel of the currents, the stars, the birds, etc. Something that has sort of confounded scientists. I think the Smithsonian and National Geographic were on it a few years ago, trying to prove how these canoe builders and these navigators were able to do what they did. But the Marshallese culture, it's a matrilineal society where land passes through the mother. So women were very important, still are, but they've lost that a bit because of the Western influence. And so the Germans arrived. You had the missionaries arriving the middle part of the 19th century. The Germans arrived trading with the Marshallese and sort of put capitalism, introduced that to society. The Japanese were administrators of the islands after World War I, and they stayed there. And then when World War II broke out, the wars in the Pacific, the civil administration turned into a military administration. And then this is where the United States shows up. So the United States defeated the Japanese in the Pacific and took over and occupied the Marshall Islands and basically just kept them. The US selected the Marshall Islands as the location to test nuclear weapons. The United States developed the atomic bomb, dropped the two existing weapons that they had produced on Japan. The war ended, and then immediately the United States had plans to test. And so they selected Bikini Atoll, which means surface of coconuts, spelled with a P. But the Bikini people were removed. They didn't understand that they would never be back, really, or at least not safely. but they were removed in March of 1946. And then the first tests happened shortly thereafter. So tests were conducted on Bikini Atoll and on another northern atoll named called Eniwetok. 67 nuclear tests ultimately were conducted. They started off pretty slowly. And then after 1954, with the Bravo detonation, they picked up in frequency and intensity. But as a result of the nuclear testing, there was widespread radiation throughout the Pacific, but specifically the Marshall Islands with the US testing, forced relocation, forcing the Marshallese, the Bikinians, the Eniwetakis, and then others that were subjected directly to fallout had to be removed. And it changed, so many things changed to the culture, just the presence of the Americans, a more masculine society removed women in a sense from the power structure and that dynamic, which is still being felt. But because the food in many of these atolls was contaminated, those that either were returned or those who were returned to some of these atolls were told not to eat the food, that they had to eat the food that was provided. And then just the whole colonial legacy of introducing these processed foods has had dire consequences on the health of the population. The Marshallese currently have one of the highest diabetes rates in the world, partly as a result of that. The most significant test was the Castle Bravo detonation, which was on March 1st, 1954. It was 1,000 times larger than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and 1,000 times larger than the bomb seen here. This is actually the second bomb that was dropped on Bikini. The Castle Bravo detonation was 1,000 times larger. It evaporated pretty much 3 islands, sucked it up into the atmosphere. The wind pushed it, and then it fell as fallout. And this is the first time we have the term fallout because of the snow-like substance that fell on the people directly of Rongelap. And this is an image here of one of the young boys. He's later going to die of leukemia about 15 years after this photo was taken. And so the interaction then with the United States and the Marshall Islands, the United States had decided to test on the Marshall Islands before asking permission, obviously, and before becoming the trustee. So the United States claimed the Marshall Islands under the auspices of the United Nations as a strategic trust territory. And so the United States was supposed to be in charge of the health and well-being of the people, develop infrastructure with the education system. For example, English became the language of instruction. It set it up just like the educational system in the United States, but did not provide the resources that we have here. That system will be in place until 1986, when a Compact of Free Association is signed. The Marshall Islands wanted to be independent. They wrote up and agreed to a constitution back in 1979, and then pushed for some sort of agreement with the United States. And so this compact was created, which allows the Marshallese to travel back and forth. This is why many of them have migrated to the United States. It also allowed the United States to maintain a military base in Kwajalein. Even though the treaty itself, the compact, is set to expire here in a couple of years, a separate agreement was signed for the base. And so that base, that does not disappear until 2060s. And so the United States made sure to hold on to that military base, regardless of what happens with the compact specifically. So we have, and again, that's just very brief look at that nuclear legacy. Obviously, lots of impacts with that ongoing biological, ecological, and cultural, because of the removal from their land, which grounded them in their culture and identity. The Marshall Islands, again, are susceptible to climate change. The Marshall Islands takes a lead in these climate talks. Tina Stagey, you might see her name in the paper with events in Scotland. I saw it this morning in a newspaper out of state. Tina is the RMI climate envoy. And so she is the main spokesperson for the Marshall Islands. Tina has worked with us since we were founded, thankfully, and it serves as our international liaison. But the climate change has an impact, not just with sea level rise, but also in some parts of the northern atolls, there's been a decline in rainfall. So some of the atolls suffer from drought, and so they need to import more water. There's the inability to grow crops, saltwater inundation with the storms that are ruining the land and the crops. And then also just increases in diseases. Before COVID even existed, the Marshalls were dealing with dengue fever. And thankfully, when COVID hit, they shut down the Marshall Islands and prevented anyone from coming in. And so they have been thankfully saved from these outbreaks that we have been dealing with locally. And then with the Marshall Islands, this is something that this nuclear climate nexus is a very popular topic. You see it everywhere. It seems like every week there's some sort of webinar or seminar discussing this. But back in 2014, when we held a nuclear remembrance event to commemorate the Bravo detonation and its impact, we had a couple of speakers reference this. And so this is one of the first times when this was actually brought out. But how this is very, it is illustrated is through a place called Runit Dome. I'm sure you've read stories and know about this, but this is at Inawaitak Atoll. So this is the second site where testing took place. And if you see, this is a crater. This is just the remnants of one of the detonations. And so that's a crater. This is referred to as the tomb or the dome. So the United States in 1977, at the urging of the Inawaitakis to clean up their atoll, went out to one of the larger islands that make up Inawaitak and collected and pushed some of the most contaminated parts of the island into one of these craters. So it was a crater just like this. They pushed it into this and then created an 18-inch thick concrete dome made up of sand from the contaminated soil. So the concrete itself is contaminated, but they pushed some of the nastiest toxic waste into this crater and then covered it. And so again, that was 1977. The Inawaitakis were brought back around 1980. And this dome, obviously it's concrete, so it is cracking. There is no liner. There was never a liner. The waste was just pushed into this. And so this is very symbolic of what happens when the impact of nuclear testing and climate change with sea level rise, really hit, because there's very much concern that this dome is going to crack open and release all of this waste into the lagoon. Though we have been told that, and we have spoken with some of these US servicemen who did much of this work, who said that there would be times where there would be barrels and barrels of this waste, plutonium included, sitting out waiting to be disposed of. And one gentleman told, or more than one, but they told us that the next morning they woke up and all these barrels were gone. Well, where'd they go? They didn't push them into this. And so the belief is that they were just pushed out into the lagoon. And so the US Army did a study and said, don't be concerned about what happens with the dome, because the lagoon is actually more toxic than what is in the dome. So this is something that's very controversial. The Marshallese government is trying to get the United States and third parties to conduct studies just to see what can happen to try to shore up the integrity of this. But regardless, it still exists at the moment. But all of this ecological, biological impact, and then the cultural impact that it has had on the Marshallese, being pushed out of their islands, again, where land is so central to identity there. And then just quickly, wanted to mention, the impact of that COVID-19 has had. Our organization really started out trying to raise awareness about, again, the history and culture, looking at the nuclear legacy, specifically climate change, humanities and arts and culture programming, working with students, try to increase educational attainment. But then when COVID hit, just pretty much everything stopped. The Marshallese were one of the most affected populations in our area. The Marshallese make up about 3% of the population of a 4-county area that makes up Northwest Arkansas. We have about 500,000 people living in Northwest Arkansas. The Marshallese make up less than 3% of that. But yet they made up about half of the deaths to COVID in June of 2020. And so lots of factors there, but the main factor is because of their underlying health conditions, the diabetes, cancer, and all of these things that the nuclear legacy has contributed to, has made them very vulnerable and susceptible to these types of diseases. And then, of course, just the craziness in this country with the politics of mask wearing and all of that ridiculousness that also contributed to so many people being sick. This is just a chart from that time that we have showed to folks. When we first found out, we knew that COVID had hit the area. Our governor shut down the state. Everybody went home, schools closed, et cetera. But then by May, people were getting antsy because there weren't that many numbers. And so our state began to reopen. So this was in May of 2020. And when this first phase of reopening, these are the number of positive cases of Marshallese residents. So the Marshallese, predominantly the workers are working in the poultry industry, in the meat packing industry. And they pretty much ignored the threat and kept people working, called them frontline workers. So they had to work. Sent a memo to President Trump at the time, and he was happy to make that so. And so here we have the rise in cases. This was the second phase of reopening of the state, and Marshallese cases continued to rise. They hit about 600 that first week of July, and then thankfully fell off since then. But the Marshallese people are still feeling the effects of the economic impact that it has had on them. So I want to just briefly show just a quick film of Benedict and Marcina. Again, it's under 3 minutes, just to talk about some of the things that they're doing. This film was for the National Nuclear Commission in the Marshall Islands, talking about their work.
My name is Benedict Madison. I'm the project specialist for youth, climate, and nuclear issues at the Marshallese Educational Initiative.
My name is Marcina Lindgren, and I am the program coordinator at the Marshallese Educational Initiative.
So I moved here in 2001 from the Marshall Islands with my family, and have been here in Arkansas since then.
So I was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and moved to Arkansas when I was 17 years old. So growing up, I honestly didn't know that much. I didn't even know that the Marshallese even had a nuclear legacy.
Well, oftentimes when we open our history books or textbooks, we see images of the bombs that were detonated in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but never the 67 nuclear weapons that were detonated in the Marshall Islands. So MEI has been working with youth for many years, ever since we were founded. Our first project was collect Marshallese oral history from our elders. The Songs of Our Atolls is a cultural project that worked with several of our elders in the community on some of the songs that the elders know, but many young people, my generation, don't know. They then share stories about the songs they sang. So it's a way to preserve the language, but also a way to preserve the culture as well. And along the way, we've also worked with students on educating them about the effects of climate change on top of the nuclear issues.
I feel empowered and I feel motivated to learn more about our history. being able to have this platform at MEI, I'm really thankful that I'm able to learn what I can from MEI and then take that and teach the younger generation. Our history is part of our manit, and our manit is who we are. And just learning, just knowing who we are, where we come from, I think that's very important.
We're here in the States, far away from our homeland, and for some of us, far away from our elders. It's important that we stay rooted with our culture, with our history, with our identity, so that we can then share these knowledge with generations in the future.
Right. So that's been a ticket, Marcina. I hope you were able to hear that. So that's what I wanted to cover, just to kind of give some background as far as what MEI does, a little brief history of the Marshall Islands and the U.S. Nuclear testing history there. So certainly open to any questions.
Thank you very much. I've learned a lot since June of this year, but even more with your presentation.